Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Robinson, and I am the West Virginia Program Manager and Communications Coordinator for the One America Movement. Thank you all so much for joining us for another episode of Candid Conversations. Candid Conversations is a part of our Corona Rebuild initiative, where we're connecting the challenges of COVID-19, the divisions in our country, and the roles we each have to play in order to move forward together. Every Friday, we'll feature someone from the One America Movement Network on our show to get candid about how division in our country has affected them, how the coronavirus has affected them, among other topics in the United States. So far, we've covered issues related to race, food insecurity, health disparities, mental health, and the conversation is certainly still ongoing. Joining us today is one of our fantastic board members, Clark Neily. Clark is the Vice President for Criminal Justice at the Cato Institute. His areas of interest include constitutional law, overcriminalization, coercive plea bargaining, police accountability, and gun rights. He received a Bachelor of Arts in Plan 2 with concentrations in philosophy and Russian from the University of Texas at Austin, and he also received his law degree from the University of Texas. Thank you so much for joining us today, Clark.
Sorry, it's my pleasure. I'm really excited to be here.
No problem, no problem. I know when we're dealing with these online situations, sometimes it's hard to realize, like, if we're muted or if we're, if our audio is connected. I know I have those issues too, but I'm super excited for this conversation. As I mentioned to you earlier, I don't know much about being a libertarian, so I'm very, very excited for this conversation. So I just want to go ahead and jump right in. Earlier in your bio, I mentioned that you are the Vice President for Criminal Justice at the Cato Institute. Can you tell us a little bit about your organization and what your job entails?
Sure. The Cato Institute is a libertarian think tank, a nonprofit that has been around for 40 years. We're the sort of preeminent libertarian think tank in the country. And essentially what Cato tries to do is to develop ideas and policies that promote the philosophy of libertarianism, which I know we're going to talk about in just a moment, but essentially entails creating the maximum amount of space for individuals to go about their lives as they see fit, and limits the power of government to restrict people's freedom.
Okay, very good, very good. As a libertarian, so you just mentioned that the Cato Institute is a libertarian organization. Can you tell us a little bit about what being a libertarian is and what it means to you?
You bet. It's really a philosophy at the end of the day. And the essence of the philosophy of libertarianism is that you have a moral obligation to leave other people alone if they're not hurting anybody. And that really is it in a nutshell. It's the idea that you don't have any particular right to go and impose your will on other people simply because you think that the world would be a better place if they did X or Y or Z. And the lack of any moral authority to impose your will on other people does not disappear if you can get 2 or 3 or however many other people to agree with you that you should altogether impose your will on another person. And at the end of the day, as I mentioned, really the only morally justifiable reason for imposing your will on another person is to prevent them from harming someone else or yourself. But if they're not doing that, then you have to leave them alone. That really is libertarianism in a nutshell.
Okay, that makes sense. I noticed that the slogan was the party of principle. Do you think you could maybe explain why that is the slogan? And then after that, I actually want to talk a little bit about the right wing, left wing thing and where libertarians tend to fall on that spectrum. But can you talk to me a little bit about the slogan and why you guys consider yourselves to be the party of principle?
So I'm not sure it's a slogan that like every libertarian necessarily subscribes to, but I do think there's something to it. Probably means different things to different people. One way to think about it would be this. The idea that you have a commitment to a certain principle means that you remain committed to that view or that conviction, even if some other principle might lead to a better result for you, for someone you care about, or maybe you just think it would make the world a better place. And the idea of not using force against other people, of not imposing your will on other people unless they are harming someone else is a principle. And it's a principle that libertarians remain committed to, even, for example, if they might be able to benefit themselves. So, for example, if I got together with some of my friends and neighbors and we all voted that you have to share all of the apples from your wonderful apple tree that you have in your backyard, it might well be the case that it would be better for me and for my neighbors if we could force you to share your apples with the rest of us, because then we would have apples. But that would be a violation of the principle that I mentioned that lies at the heart of libertarianism. Why? Because we would be using force to make you give something to us that we want, but that wouldn't necessarily be in your best interest. But more importantly, we don't have any moral right to impose our will on you, to force you to give us your apples, even if it would make us better off. That is a commitment to principle.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. So it seems like it's more so an idea that you have a right to do what you please, and I have no right to impose my thoughts and beliefs on you.
Yeah, that's right. Up until the point, again, where you might be harming somebody else. So for example, if you have a belief that children should only eat one meal a week, right? That's harmful to those children, and that would provide a basis for other people to impose their will on you to make you change your behavior. But for example, thinking that children should learn mathematics, at an early age. You think they should. I think they shouldn't. I don't have any basis to impose my belief on you. Neither do you have any basis to impose your belief on me. Libertarianism essentially says that we're entitled, at least, within some wide measure, to make the decisions that we think are best. It does get a little bit more difficult when you're dealing with children, so that may not have been the best example. Maybe a better example would be to say, hey, very clearly we have an increase in the number of certain health problems in this country, including diabetes, obesity, and heart and lung issues. Everybody would be better off if they would just exercise once in a while. That might be a better example, right? Because probably people would be better off if they exercise. Does that then give me a basis to force them to do it? And a libertarian would say the answer is clearly no.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. And in my research on libertarianism, it's hard. It seems like a lot of people are confused about where libertarians tend to fall on the political spectrum. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk to me a little bit about that. Do you consider yourself to be right-wing? Do you consider yourself to be left-wing? Or do you consider yourself to be kind of in the middle?
It's a great question. It's challenging. I think part of the problem here is that metaphors have limits, and the idea that politics represents kind of a continuum like this, and you've got maybe, liberals or progressives or Democrats on one side, and you got conservatives or Republicans on the other, is probably not entirely accurate. I don't think I see myself as sort of falling somewhere along that continuum. I find myself more in the position of saying, I have certain philosophical convictions and beliefs about good and bad policy that align with the preferred policies of Democrats in some situations and with Republicans in others, and oftentimes with neither of them. And
Right.
So I don't really think that I could say coherently, that I'm more aligned with one side or the other, or even that I fall somewhere in between. I simply have a set of convictions that have some overlap with Democrats on some issues, with Republicans on other issues, and as I said, neither of the major parties on many other issues. So wherever that puts me, where I am.
Yes, that makes sense. It can still be, I guess, confusing for people who do believe that it's just you're either one or the other. But to me, it makes sense what you're saying. Are there any misconceptions about libertarians that you'd like to debunk?
Yeah, I think the big one is that, libertarians are heartless and we don't care about other people because, we embrace this philosophy that says that generally speaking, you have to leave other people alone. Even frankly, if they're making some poor life choices or choices that appear to us to be poor. An example of that would be the use of certain drugs. Some people would say, listen, if you choose to use, heroin or some other opiate, there's just no way that can be done, in a kind of a non-self-destructive way. And so therefore I have the moral authority, or more accurately, if I can convince a Democratic majority of my friends and neighbors that we should, make it a crime and then punish you for choosing to engage in that behavior, then that's a legitimate thing to do. And that if I don't support that policy, that must mean I don't care about people, for example, who abuse heroin or become addicted to it and have bad outcomes. What's really going on here, at least from my perspective, is simply that I care a lot about that person. Don't get me wrong. I just don't happen to think that putting a gun to their head, in effect, and saying, look, stop doing that thing that I think is so self-destructive, or I'll put you in a cage, right? I don't happen to think that's a very good policy. And so that's why I don't support, for example, laws prohibiting drugs. I think there's a better approach. Maybe an even sort of more whimsical way to put it would be this. Imagine that somebody is shivering and cold and they don't have any heat in their house. Somebody then says, hey, I'm gonna pass a law that says that everybody has to contribute $100 to this person who doesn't have any heat in their home. And then we'll take all those dollars and we'll put them in a trash can and we'll burn them. Well, that would certainly produce some heat, but I don't think it would be a very effective way of addressing the problem, right? For about 30 seconds, that person is going to feel warmer while we burn all that cash. But could there maybe have been some more effective way of using that money to solve the problem of the person who's shivering with cold in their home? As a libertarian, I think the answer is very obviously yes. There were lots of other more effective things we could have done with that money. So if I don't then support the let's throw a bunch of dollar bills in a trash can and set them on fire policy, does that mean I don't care about that person and I don't want to help solve their problem of being cold? Absolutely not. It means I think there's a better way to go about it than the way the government often does, which is the government often embraces highly inefficient and ineffective solutions to problems. That's usually the reason why libertarians don't get on board. It's not because we don't care. It's because we think there's a better way to do it than coercing a bunch of people into supporting an ineffective policy.
Okay, that makes sense. And I think the way that you put it, I think it might make it easier for people to understand. Because I know, have you ever watched Parks and Rec?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so then you're familiar with Ron Swanson. Right. And you know how they make his character seem like he's just this heartless person who outwardly doesn't care about anyone.
Yeah.
I think that's a common misconception that people have about libertarians. So I really appreciate you debunking that. I do want to talk about some current events. As a libertarian, what do you think of the election and the state of our country right now?
I'm anxious. I think that the behavior of some individuals involved in the election has been disgraceful, starting with President Trump. In my view, he was very clearly beaten. There's no realistic path to victory for him. I think the decision to challenge vote counts in various places is an irresponsible one. And I think he is engaged in a campaign of demagoguery, trying to convince his supporters that there were systemic efforts to alter the outcome of this election. There's not a shred of credible evidence that in fact that happened, and there's to the contrary a mountain of evidence to indicate that did not happen. So I'm anxious by what I'm seeing. I'm anxious at the number of people who seem to be open to that narrative that the president is spinning about the prospects of the election having been tinkered with in some or meddled with in some significant fashion. I'm angry that congressional Republicans, most of them, have not stepped up and put patriotism ahead of party and made clear that they and anyone on whom they have any influence should accept the democratic results of that election. I think that's incredibly irresponsible. I will also say that I'm incredibly disillusioned by the quality of the candidates that have been advanced by the two major political parties in the last few election cycles. I'm not going to sit here and throw rocks. I know some people probably supported some of those candidates. I didn't. may have voted. Well, I will tell you that I voted against the sitting president, but not really because I was enthusiastic about supporting Joe Biden. That was a protest vote on my part. So I'm dismayed at what I consider to be the incredibly low quality of the candidates that have been offered by the two major parties. And I wish that there was more room for people whose policy preferences and underlying philosophical convictions don't map well onto the values of those two major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. I'm not really a political scientist, so I'm not going to delve into this too deep, but I do know that there's a significant number of people in this country who feel disillusioned that in order to have real political efficacy, you really have to align with one party or the other. And I don't feel comfortable in either party. Both of them embrace policies and to some extent values that I find abhorrent. And so there's no real, I would say there's no political home currently in this country for many of us to consider ourselves to be libertarians. And it can be a bit dismaying.
Yeah, I can see that. And I kind of agree with that as well. You mentioned that you feel a little bit anxious. Can you talk a little bit about why you feel anxious with the results and what you're seeing in the country right now?
Well, I feel anxious because I think for the first time in about 150 years, there's a very real prospect that the peaceful transition of power is in doubt. And I think ultimately there will be a peaceful transition of power. But I'm not as confident of that as I'd like to be. I'd like to be 100% confident of that, and I'm not. Right. And that, that leaves open some pretty scary scenarios. I certainly hope and believe that they will not come to pass, but I think that there's more of a possibility, over the next few months than at any time in my adult life. And so that's concerning. I think also another concern I have is the apparent ease with which President Trump was able to create an impression on the part of his followers that there's some reason to question the results of this election. As I mentioned a moment ago, I don't believe there's any reason to question the results of this election. Of course, there were some ballots that were cast inappropriately. That happens every single election, and I'm sure it happened this election. I'm not aware of a shred of evidence to support the proposition that happened more on one side than on the other side, and the idea that there was in fact a concerted effort on the part of Democrats to ensure that their candidate won this election is, I think, extraordinarily far-fetched and disrespectful, and not supported by, again, even a shred of credible evidence. But nevertheless, the president, according to the latest polls that I've seen, has been successful in creating an impression among a surprising number of his followers that there are real grounds to doubt the integrity of this election. I think that is an extraordinarily dangerous assault on the basic premise of democracy, and it's rather obviously caused a national division over the question of who should be the president of this country and what constitutes a legitimate election. I think that's a wound that may not heal very quickly, and that's concerning.
It is very concerning. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. You served as co-counsel on the District of Columbia versus Heller case, in which the Supreme Court held that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to own a gun. How do we balance individual rights with public safety when it comes to firearms?
Yeah, it's a perfectly fair question, and I'll say it this way. There are very few rights, the exercise of which presents no risk to other people. We just got finished talking about a president who has exercised his right of free speech in an extraordinarily irresponsible way that produces, I think, tremendous risk for the country. But he has a right to do it. And if there is a successful transition of power and President Biden becomes the next president of the country, as I'm confident that he will be, as a former president, Donald Trump will have a First Amendment right to continue engaging in irresponsible and dangerous and damaging speech. And that's the price that comes with living in a country that respects individual rights. I happen to believe there is an individual right of self-defense. I think you have a right to defend yourself if somebody tries to harm you. And I think there's a right of armed self-defense within certain bounds. That's like all constitutional rights. There are certainly limits on the Second Amendment, just as there are limits even on the First Amendment right of free speech. So I think that's one point, is that we recognize that there's no sort of perfectly happy outcome. Take, for example, the ability to drive a car. That's not even mentioned in the text of the Constitution, but I still think you have a constitutional right to do it. Just as you have a constitutional right to get married and have children. Those are other rights that are not mentioned in the text of the Constitution. That's a whole separate discussion why those rights can still be protected. But let's just focus on the proposition which the Supreme Court has embraced, that there is in fact a constitutional right to travel, which I think would imply a constitutional right to drive a car. That's a hazardous activity. In fact, more people die in motor vehicle accidents than die from guns. And we have made an effort to embrace smart policies to try to protect life when people exercise their right to drive a car, including not driving while you're intoxicated, not using your smartphone while you're driving, wearing a seatbelt, etc. I think we've really largely done the same thing with guns. People are surprised to hear this, but the ability to own a firearm, contrary to what you'll hear from many people who kind of demagogue on this issue, firearms are one of the most highly regulated consumer products in the country. You have to jump over a lot of hoops and hurdles in many places to acquire them, and then also to carry them. Not everywhere, but in many places. And so there are already a lot of regulations on the books. A lot of people don't realize this. The vast majority, or I should say 2/3 of gun deaths were actually suicides. Now, what that suggests is not that they're any less tragic, but it suggests that perhaps the solution to a very significant number of gun deaths is to focus somewhere else besides guns, maybe to focus on mental health issues. If fewer people were feeling suicidal, then presumably there would be far fewer suicides and therefore deaths by guns. So that's something that perhaps we should be more focused on. At the end of the day, as I suggested a moment ago, it's like so many other things. We will never prevent people from dying from drug overdoses simply by ratcheting up the amount of regulation. We have tried to enforce our way out of that problem, and it's not working. In fact, the number of deaths by opiate overdose is increasing, not decreasing, even as we keep ramping up the amount of criminal enforcement. I don't think there's any reason to suppose it would be any different with firearms. The point is that there are lots of activities that can be hazardous. And I recognize that people think guns are different because they're designed to kill. I get that. But there are lots of hazardous activities. And there's no sort of magic solution to anything, whether it's car accidents, opiate overdoses, or firearms deaths. There's just better and worse policies. I think we've embraced a lot of good policies with firearms already. I'm open to others, for example, including red flag laws that would enable the government to identify people who are in a particularly hazardous place right now and maybe shouldn't own firearms. But even those laws won't be perfect. There'll be all kinds of unintended consequences there. But at the end of the day, we've got a constitutional right, or at least one that the Supreme Court has recognized. And so we have to try to find the best policy that we can that simultaneously respects the individual right of people to own a gun, own a car, or in my view, ingest whatever substances make them feel better. That is the last of which is not a right that the Supreme Court has acknowledged. That just happens to be my idiosyncratic libertarian coming out.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for that. Yeah, it seems like it's hard because you're right. There's never going to be a perfect solution. There's always going to be an unintended consequence, as you mentioned. So it can be, I'm sure, making these policy decisions is very difficult for the people who are making them. I did want to talk a little bit about you being a One America board member. So as I mentioned earlier, you are a part of our board. I just want to know, what made you decide to join our organization's fight against toxic polarization?
Well, I'm really glad to get a chance to talk about that. It's an organization that's very dear to my heart, as you know very well. I think I would say this. In his book, Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville talked about how one of the most unique things about America is the prevalence of so-called civic organizations. These are organizations that are not run by the government. They don't have any particular official status or standing. They're organizations of private individuals coming together in an effort to try to basically make the world or even just their neighborhood better in some way. And you can think of any number of them. I mean, the Boy Scouts would be one example, and the Girl Scouts, the Rotary Club, Lions, all of these things. These are all civic organizations, and I think it's a really beautiful thing because you don't force anybody to support it. There's, you don't have the ability to go out and say, "Oh, you have to pay money to contribute to my organization." You may try to sell them some cookies and get their money that way. But these are associations of private individuals working to improve the quality of life for all of us. And I think there's something incredibly moving about that and respectful in the sense that you're not out there forcing people to join your organization. You're not forcing people to support it. You're trying to earn their support by the quality of the work that you do and the results that you produce. And I think so I have a sort of a pre-existing sympathy for and kind of desire to be a part of that process. With respect to the One America movement in particular, everything that we've been talking about practically during this conversation, I think points in the direction that one of the biggest challenges we face as a country and one of the biggest concerns I think we should all have is precisely the issue of toxic polarization. It's the tendency to say that if you're not in my same political party or you don't have the same views that I do on hot button issues like gun rights versus gun control, then you and I have to be, if not enemies, then at least opponents. You're somebody that I don't want to associate with. You're somebody that there's no point in interacting with. You're somebody I don't want to talk to. That's what I think of when I say toxic polarization. And what we know through our work with One America is that really is a kind of an illusion. There actually is almost always far more that you have in common with somebody than the things that you have apart that push you apart. And you think about something like, you might be walking down the street with somebody wearing a MAGA hat, right? And you've got your, Biden-Harris t-shirt on, and you guys are giving each other the side eye. But if somebody gets into a car wreck and they're trapped in their car, or you come across a house that's on fire, you and that MAGA cap wearing person are almost certainly going to put all of your differences aside and start working together to help that other person. If we could just remember that that's who we truly are. Why should politics be something that defines who we are to that extent? Why should it be the essential, essence of our identity? I don't think it should be. I think the essential essence of our identity should be the values that almost all of us share, right? That we want to have a country in which people are free to be their best selves. We want to have a country in which nobody goes hungry, nobody goes without an education, nobody goes without medical care when they are desperately in need of it. There are so many different ways to achieve those outcomes, and sometimes that causes disagreement among us. But what we almost never disagree on, if we drill down deep enough, is the really fundamental underlying values. And I think One America is very clearly an organization that is dedicated to helping remind people that if they just dig down deep enough, what they'll discover is they have so much more in common at the level of values with their friends and neighbors, and even people that they think of perhaps as opponents, than the things that divide us. And we really, really need to be reminded of that and to recommit to that value as a country, I think.
Definitely. I 100% agree. Obviously, I work here, so I definitely share that sentiment. I have one last question for you. With a new president recently elected and all of the distrust surrounding that and all of the division that we've discussed during this conversation, what are your hopes for the future of our country?
Honestly, my hope is that both political parties will kind of walk back from this, sort of brink that we've come to. And I'm going to make this is going to sound like a plug for libertarianism, and maybe it is, but I mean this sincerely. When the government controls so much, when it takes so much of the gross national product to decide how to spend, when it passes laws that result in the government being involved in every little nook and cranny of our lives, from how we go about educating our children to, again, the substances that we choose to put in our body, et cetera, the stakes are enormous for which set of government officials are in control of all that power. If we could limit the amount of power that the government has and the extent to which it is involved in our lives, then the stakes on the political side would be lower as well. And so my sense is that if people would be willing to give their friends and neighbors a little more leeway to decide for themselves how to go about their lives, then that would be reciprocated. And I think what we would discover again is that when we're not fighting over who's in control of spending $5 or $6 trillion a year as the federal budget, then we have less to fight about and we can get back to being friends.
Thank you so much. I like that you ended on that, back to being friends. I really appreciate that. Unfortunately, that is our time for today. And I want to thank you so much for joining us again. I've had a really great time chatting with you, and I feel like I learned a lot. Before we head out, though, I do want to ask, is there any website or any place where people can go to learn a little bit more about what we've discussed today?
Yes, really quickly. One of my main focuses at Cato doing criminal justice work is government accountability, and specifically ensuring that police, prosecutors, and other government officials who abuse their power are held properly accountable. We created a whole website dedicated to a particular legal issue that some people may have heard of, qualified immunity, which is what I describe sometimes as the cornerstone of our near zero accountability policy for government officials. I'd love for people to check that out. If they have questions, I'm delighted to connect with them and tell them what they can do to help eliminate this accountability destroying legal doctrine that the Supreme Court invented about 40 years ago.
Okay, and that website is unlawfulshield.com. So you guys make sure to check that out to learn more about what Clark and I have discussed today and qualified immunity. I want to remind everyone to also check out our website, www.oneamericamovement.org. You can also find us on Facebook at One America Movement, and you can also find us on Twitter at One America Movement, but without the vowels, just MVMT. Make sure you guys join us next week for another episode of Candid Conversations. Until then, I hope you guys enjoy your weekend. Thank you so much for tuning in.